Okay. Just give me a little bit more volume. I'm here. Just give me a little bit more volume. More. Great. Okay. Brilliant. Thanks. If people want to take their seats, we can kind of get going. Okay. Why don't you come in a little bit? I think you're going to have more fun, or less fun, more work. Okay. Hello. Hi. Simon. How do you do? Very good.
Please, Simon, you have until 6.
2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And I've still got my 2 speakers only, right?
Yes.
Good. We're good. Yeah, no, totally. Okay, folks, I'd like to get started. If people can just sort of collapse in a heap somewhere on a table. And even if you're asleep, be quiet. Okay, but it's a nice table though, right? So there are some seats over here if people want to hang on in here. Still coming. Right. Yeah, we just lost half an hour. That's the only thing I'm aware of. Cheeky, huh? Okay, folks, I'm keen to make a start. If people could kind of just chill back a little bit. So this session runs for, let me just deal with process for a second. So this session runs for 2.5 hours, so it's down from 3, so I'm a little bit more stretched on time, just because we spent a bit of time doing whatever it is we just did. And so I'm going to do a fairly short and sharp entrance with no slides, since we're assuming at least 6 blackouts between now and 6 o'clock. So anybody who's using slides is just on a sort of fool's errand. Then I'm going to get my 2 colleagues to each kind of punt, and we've chatted, and they're going to be really interesting. Then we're going to throw it out for a bit of conversation about these 2 examples or any issues coming up from what I said, and then we're going to do broadly sort of the thing on the table that you all did this morning, or most of you will have done this morning in a previous session. So we kind of start with the subject, which is displaced people or migrants and refugees. The panel runs through it, we focus on that topic, but then when we get to the tables, we sort of turn the whole thing upside down. And the use case, and displacement becomes a use case for which you can hopefully draw some inspirational lessons that are relevant to your work. And then we'll kind of pull that information back into the room. I'm looking around at organizers to make sure I haven't said something that's completely wrong, but I think it's broadly right. Does that make sense? Anybody in the wrong room, science fiction down the road? I'm still offering anybody to take over my session so that I can join, but no, okay, right, then I will do it. So my name is Simon Zadek. I'm based in New York. I work for UNDP. I sit in the office of the administrator. I've been there about 6 months. Before that, these are only for the UN nerds in the room. I was in the EOSG, so I sat in the Secretary General's office for a year, supporting the development of his work on financing, which is sort of my background, which is why I'm going to talk about migration, which is definitely not my background. And sitting in UNDP, the task I've been asked to look at is quite similar to what brings us here to Istanbul today and over the coming days, which is how do we understand some of the changing configurations of what we do. So not how do we understand migration necessarily, or X, Y, Z, but how do we understand the changing configurations of not just how we work or how we raise money or what's a project in the UN system, and all of that sort of plumbing stuff, which hopefully is not in the room today. But how do we understand how we make change in a changing world? You know, we all know the language of innovation and system thinking, and all that stuff now is sort of embedded, sadly, in our brains, and we sort of dream it at night. But how do we really translate that into what we do? And so the question I've been asked by the administrator and the senior management team is, what kind of platform would one build at the corporate level in New York that built out a small portfolio of projects focused on large-scale trends that are trying to shift part of the focus of UNDP to upstream intervention, system-level intervention, obviously with implications downstream at the country level, but to sort of get back to something, as I understand, UNDP used to do in the past, but obviously it's today, so we need to figure out how to do that in different ways. And migrants and refugees are sort of one of several pieces of work in the portfolio of this initiative, Project Catalyst. So that's just a 5-second sort of bio-institutional note, and I can now kick on. So I'm, as I said, not going to use slides. I am going to use my iPad since my memory is a little faded. So as I said in the room, the subject is migrants and refugees, and I'm just going to keep talking about displaced people, which UNHCR and IOM would tell me is absolutely the wrong thing to do. You know, but I'm just going to use a sort of generic word, displaced people, for folks that for one reason or another have to leave where they are, end up somewhere else, don't have full rights of citizenship, and are stranded temporarily, but potentially temporarily for a hell of a long time. So that's kind of what our subject is, sort of stripping the sort of technocratic language out of the game just for now. We all sort of know the numbers. You know, it depends on how you count it, but there's something like 70 million displaced people today. Yeah, and actually it doesn't matter whether it's 50 or 90, it's a hell of a lot of people, and they are scattered around the world. They don't make up an homogenous group, except for the fact that they operate without the full rights of citizenship. Yeah, they may be poor. Actually, some of them may not be so poor if they're living in countries where they're able to kind of get other stuff done. But in the main, it's a humanitarian problem, and it's understood as a humanitarian problem. What does that mean? So it means that in very simplistic terms, perhaps not something you would immediately Twitter, because it would be a career ender for me, handling displaced people is a pipeline business. It's a pipeline business. Somebody gets displaced, they end up somewhere where they're in a fragile, perhaps dangerous, perhaps under-serviced, supported situation. The job of the displaced people industry is to keep them safe, is to potentially add services, say education for children, and to either get them home or, as I said earlier, sort of metaphorically get them to Sweden, i.e. get them to some other third country that is willing to take them on. And what we know is that this system is under huge stress, notably over recent years. Obviously, we're in Turkey today, and I'm sure I don't need to say to anyone that Turkey houses the largest number of displaced people of any country in the world, certainly relative to its population, to its standard of living, and so on. So, we're in a particular place where this conversation also has unusual merit. Does it work? So the pipeline model sort of works a bit. We all know that. But actually what we know is that the numbers are increasing, and the duration of someone typically displaced by almost any measure is increasing, 10, 15, 17 years. The number keeps growing all the time, which kind of shows you, if you're interested in a sort of a different kind of a metaphor, that we're moving from a sort of pipeline model like the Rhine or the Rhone, since we're in Europe, more to something like Lake Geneva. Lake Geneva actually also has water flowing through it. It just takes 70 years for water to go from one end to the other end. So it looks like a lake. Actually, it's just a river moving very, very slowly. Yeah, and so the displacement challenge becomes that we have more and more people who are in transition, but not really enough, yeah? And that's before the numbers get bigger, yeah? And as I said again in the room earlier, we have no idea really what the future is going to bring us, but we might speculate that a mixture of conflict, of climate change, of, let me call it, the ravages of automation on employment opportunities that creates economic insecurities, at the lower end of skill levels in particular, all of those things are going to drive more and more people to become displaced. Yeah? And as I said, the lower end of the estimates are in the 300-400 million level by 2040. The higher estimates, official, not scaremongering, are in the billion level. And so I have no idea whether it's 300 million or a billion, and at some level I don't care. The important piece is it's a hell of a lot of people. It's way more than we have now, and our current model doesn't work properly, so what happens next? Yeah, so what happens next? Do we continue to pour money into countries trying to keep them back? Look at the recent deal cut between the US and Mexico. Keep them home, send them home. Is that really fair, reasonable, just, let alone viable? Or do we have to start reconceiving our understanding of what displacement means in the 21st century? Yeah, easy to say, of course difficult if you're a member of the Rohingya community or in some other highly stressed situation. So it's easy to have a sort of a nice conceptual chat here, and we should try and avoid being sort of flippant about the topic, obviously, deadly serious. And yet at the same time, somewhere, there is a narrative shift that is needed, arguably, in order to help us reconceive the problem and therefore begin to reconceive solutions. And so the what if, in a sense, becomes, what if large numbers of displaced people in some shape or form were conceived of as a global population that were afforded certain rights and responsibilities? Let's call it citizenship, just for laughs. What if a large number of displaced people, by virtue of the data they provide, perhaps, could access livelihood opportunities that, for example, Denmark would not allow today a displaced person to access within the domestic labor market? So you don't even have to go to highly stressed countries. Most countries that are hosting displaced people not only are holding them without citizenship, but will not allow them to earn a secure livelihood, which of course makes them even more dependent on the state or international funds, which makes them even more resented. So that sort of externality of that toxic politics, which isn't just about displaced people, but begins to influence many other agendas that we're addressing in the broader sustainable development space. So it turns out that my nutty suggestion, let's call it a migrant nation, although the language doesn't matter right now, isn't so far away from stuff that's happening already. That already we have hundreds and hundreds of innovations, of which we're going to hear two, but there are hundreds of others, of organizations building platforms to enable, largely through service opportunities, enable displaced people to access finance when they can't access finance in their host country, to start a business when they're not allowed to start a business within their host country, to trade across borders when in principle they can't do that, and so on. That actually we have hundreds and hundreds of fascinating innovations around the world that are precisely emerging in order to support a growing number of displaced people that can't, through virtue of their lack of citizenship, access the vertical structure of services and opportunities that would be available if they were living in the country of which they were a citizen. So what I'm describing actually is far from mythical, let alone science fiction, which I don't really encourage you to go to, and is actually quite real with a but. And the but is that all of these initiatives are really small. All of these initiatives are really fragmented. All of these initiatives are underscaled, under-resourced, disconnected, and sit there as individual initiatives, and I'm not pointing at these guys, but I may do later, going, if only we could be bigger, if only we could be scaled up, if only the Danish would give us more money, or if only we could sort of become a bigger organization by virtue of some sort of development operation. On the other hand, one might think about this slightly differently, so here perhaps is a second shift. Can you imagine a world of apps without an operating system, without an Apple Store? Can you imagine a whole series of innovations that you're trying to access that somehow have no interconnectivity, have no common sets of principles, don't require from you as a consumer or a citizen or a displaced person the same set of information? Or can you imagine, an NGO platform that's giving, small loans to displaced people who aren't connected to another initiative that's doing crowdsourcing or peer-to-peer lending, that isn't gathering money in other ways? So Kiva is sitting there as a really interesting, lending platform for displaced people, but it understands its upstream opportunity as being get another bunch of development money, and then we can on-lend it. Actually, there is no future in a model of that kind. There is no real scale in a model of that kind. So there is a disconnection between some of the many interesting innovations that are out there trying to do exactly what I'm describing, affording, in a sense, rights and responsibilities to people who are displaced. Let's call it citizenship, allowing them to access a whole range of digital services and often livelihood opportunities and pathways. And so the notion of the migrant nation, with the right or the wrong language, becomes sort of, is one able to create some sort of operating system, some sort of union, some sort of association, where there are a common set of principles that determine the rights of the individual within it, wherever their displacement might be, but that also determine the way in which those many different crowded-in financial services and market opportunities might operate, so that they themselves are subject to some level of control, some level of influence, perhaps some level of ownership of displaced people themselves. And so that's one of the pieces of work that that we as Project Catalyst within UNDP are looking at. Now I want to just finish with sort of 2 or 3 just more sort of cross-cutting observations, which come back to the sort of the broader topic that we're addressing in the days that we're spending here together. First of all, great idea maybe, maybe not. Lots of interesting things going on, but imagine those that are lined up arguing that this is a really bad way of thinking. Not even utopian, or impractical, but a really lousy way of thinking about moving forward. Many people who've worked for many years on migrants and refugee issues, have focused much of their energy on trying to enforce and force governments to take on their responsibilities to protect, support, and integrate displaced people into the communities that those governments oversee. They would argue beginning to think of transboundary solutions that don't involve states but begin to create rights independently of sovereign states actually takes the pressure off of governments to do exactly what we've been asking them to do, year on year, decade on decade, month on month. So you have a direct tension between the existing model, which certainly doesn't work as much as we would like it to, is unlikely to work in the future if the numbers growth are realized as expected. And at the same time, if one takes any pressure away from sovereign states to fulfill their responsibilities, as redefined again within the UN Global Compact on migrants and the Global Compact on refugees, the argument is we become part of the solution, but part of the problem, not part of the solution. So this articulation between the incumbent approach, in this case, which is inadequate but hard fought for and won, and any sort of meta-innovation becomes really critical. In a complex world, it's very hard to go 1 + 1 = 2, i.e. let's take the incumbent model, add another new idea, and get something more. Yeah, what's more likely is that the interaction between the incumbent model and some new way of doing things has all sorts of unexpected consequences that one's got to at least think about and try and figure out how to deal with. The second part of it, really voiced very strongly in a meeting that we held 2 or 3 weeks ago in London, 1 or 2 people in the room today were there, was a view, let me put it in a caricatured but realistic way, yet another good idea of what you can do for us, was how it was expressed by many displaced people who were in the room in the conversation. And their argument was, thinking about transborder opportunities, affording rights and responsibilities that are not specifically those given by Westphalian states, opening up a digital world that allows people to secure a livelihood when the country you're, all of that is fine, but it's you lot trying to figure it out for us lot again. Where do we as displaced people get into this story as actors of change and of controllers of our own destiny? And so one of the big discussions that happened over the few days in London where we debated this was the way in which one might connect together not only that sort of critical livelihood piece, which is important, and without which the toxic politics and problems will continue to grow. And on the other hand, the rights of displaced people to be party to decisions about the kinds of organizations that provide services. Do I like this guy or don't I like this guy? Who owns the business that is providing these services to the Rohingya community? Is he personally benefiting from it? Is he employing disabled people? Kind of what is the ownership structure of his NGO, and so on. I know you're a wonderful person. And so quite rightly, the questions were framed, you can't just kind of put out and try and push forward a way of thinking about economic opportunities, although it's important, you have to connect it to a way of thinking about governance. You have to connect it to a way of thinking about governance. And then 2 different things happen. One set of people in the room said, and we need a governance model, and then, I put my hands metaphorically over my eyes as they said it, because they sort of described the UN. And I've been in the UN long enough to know that's probably not a very good idea. So they described representation and boards and councils and governance models, and then we're a nation, right? Because nations organize themselves in that way. And then we had another bunch of people in the room who, were very nice techno geeks, and they described how cryptocurrencies, could drive high levels of trust, ways in which to assess and, give credit or not to service organizations, that were or weren't sort of what they really needed. They talked about how to intertwine governance far more into the market process of economic development. So, not binary, but 2 very different ways of thinking about sort of economics plus politics, or a political economy where markets and governance within a displaced community begin to evolve hand in hand. So my simple ask is first of all, and I don't think this is a difficult ask, is that we appreciate the problem rather than debating the language or the numbers. I don't think that's of great interest. That we understand the importance of economic livelihoods, the work that we focused on, whilst in no way reducing the importance of many other aspects of what makes up, the complete thinking about well-being of displaced people. So try not to binary that. And thirdly, to kind of try to keep that mind focused on the interaction both between new thinking and the incumbent model for helping displaced people, and the economic side of the proposition, if you like, and the political side of the proposition and the way in which they interact with each other. Great, so that was my without slides and without a blackout. So there you go. So no slides, no blackout, lots of slides, instant blackout. So that's my opening. So I'm now going to ask, just before I mean, is there any sort of somebody sitting there going, holy crap, that's ridiculous, and wants to say something or ask something before I go on to the sort of two key use cases? Can you scream, or do you need a... Just stand up, you can scream better.
Thank you again for these remarks. My name is Wafa. I work for UNDP PAP, Palestine. I was expecting, when we talk about displaced population and refugees, not only to think about how we react when the crisis happened, because the world experienced many catastrophic crises, like what happened in Palestine, Syria, happening now in Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, in many countries. And I expect that UNDP needs to think, or may think differently about how to be proactive and think about influencing political situation, the political agendas and all of that, rather than just take care of displaced population because they have become displaced population. Palestinian refugees are refugees from 1948. And now the UNRWA that was invented and created by the UN system is facing this limitation, financial limitation, because of the US administration. So where are we from this? Where are the solutions and innovative ideas in order to prevent this from happening and to think differently? This is, for me, is how we think differently, other than taking the crisis results and then try to provide some services. Thank you very much.
Completely my pleasure. So just a sort of a short answer, not to trivialize it, but just to sort of keep the process going. So, of course, you're absolutely right that there are many points of intervention that are needed. And actually, I would argue UNDP has almost exclusively focused on the area that you're identifying, which is the development process within countries. Yeah? And that's actually UNDP's history, because displacement has been understood as a humanitarian issue, and what happens in individual countries has been understood as a development issue. And of course, we all know that the UN is broken up into peace and security, humanitarian, and development, without wanting to oversimplify the different pillars. But what happens, not if you're wrong, but what happens if one begins to see that the bit that we have conceived of as being the humanitarian approach of dealing with crisis, so if it's gone wrong, if one hasn't managed to prevent it going wrong, it becomes a permanent part of our development architecture. I guess, so I think my response would be a sort of an and. I think UNDP in particular, in the UN system, but also other UN agencies, focuses actually almost exclusively on that kind of pre-crisis problem, or pre-crisis challenge and opportunity to try and prevent displacement. But I guess I'm sort of casting into that second side and going, what happens if that's no longer just a manifestation of individual crisis, but a permanent feature of the way in which our world works? Is there a development lens that we need to throw on that goes beyond a humanitarian response and therefore requires different kinds of institutions, different kinds of governance processes, different ways of understanding what the evolution of communities that are displaced really means over the long term? So it's an and, in my view, not a, it's either or. Any other sort of... Let's move on. We have time. Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to start, I think we're going to start with you, yeah? Does that make sense, or do you want to? Okay, and so let's start with the Rohingya case and then move on to the healthcare one. I think we're sharing mics. I think we have to bring the lights down.
Yeah, if you can bring my slides. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank UNDP for bringing myself and the Rohingya project here on this very interesting and innovative event. And unfortunately, I wasn't the first one who was slated to be here. It was actually my colleague and Rohingya founder of the Rohingya project, Muhammad Noor, but he couldn't make it because of visa issues. So I'm here. My name is Saqib Sheikh, and I am the project director for the Rohingya project. I'm also very familiar with Simon because we were there at the Migrant Nation event. So I'm glad to see that some of the themes that we talk about with the Rohingya project are being talked about on a much larger level. And what I hope to do today is not just introduce a project, but perhaps give a bit of explanation of why we felt this project was necessary, and then what may be a bit unique in our approach towards this issue of statelessness. And as I go along with describing the project itself, I'll state very openly, a lot of what we're describing is not new in the sense that we're coming up with some fancy new technology or some very different, radically different application. What makes it a bit different is perhaps the use case specific to the Rohingya and how we're going about doing it, which is different from maybe a standard NGO approach. Okay, going right into it. Okay, so we start by saying by the Rohingya, for the Rohingya. The reason we say this is because not just our founders Rohingya, but also most of our team is Rohingya. We have around 40 to 50 Rohingya staff members, and I'm one of the minorities who's not Rohingya. I'm Pakistani American, so I'm hoping in a few years they would call me honorary Rohingya. But our approach is very much grassroots driven. We feel that for the Rohingya, who are of course suffering, as we all are aware, anybody who reads the headlines, from persecution in Burma, any really substantive approach that is going to be a game changer has to come from the Rohingya diaspora community itself, and recognizing the tremendous work that is done by NGOs, done by UN agencies, and done by different governments in different capacities. We recognize that. But as I'll explain, there is a case of what you could call institutional paralysis on the Rohingya issue, which necessitates a solution coming from the community itself. Okay. So talking a bit just about the problem statement, this is just a very large overview. Our project is focused on financial inclusion of the Rohingya through a digital ID system brought to us by blockchain. And I'll explain why we're using blockchain and what the nature is of the financial system. But just to first start, what is the reality for a young Rohingya today? Now, our project, we try and separate Rohingya into two categories. One is, or you could say three categories. One are the Rohingya who are in Rakhine State right now, who are in a conflict zone. And I don't need to elaborate further on what they're going through. The second are Rohingya who are refugees, those who are escaping persecution with nothing more than perhaps the clothes on their back and maybe a few possessions. And their situation is one of needing immediate humanitarian aid and needing provisions such as food, shelter, a bag of rice, etc. Those are the Rohingya refugees. Of course, we know that in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar, you have a large part of them. And the third category are stateless Rohingyas. So not all Rohingya are refugees, but almost all Rohingya are stateless. And by stateless, we mean those Rohingya who are in diaspora, who have been situated in host societies like Malaysia, Thailand, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, for 2, 3, and now coming to maybe 4 generations. And in their specific situation, they may have been born in their host society. They've never seen the Rakhine State, they've never seen their homeland. But they are, in terms of their identification, deprived of the most basic tool of a 21st century citizen. So the vast majority of Rohingya don't have the basic tool of identification. Even in Malaysia, where we're situated, only a fraction of the Rohingya are able to actually even get a UNHCR card. So when I talk about institutional paralysis, depending on the Rohingya, which country they're in, and what the political nature is in that country, they either have access to certain resources or they don't. But almost as a common thread throughout the diaspora situation, we find that having access to an identity is one of the most common problems. And it's hard to get a consensus of how many of them are deprived of an ID, but it's somewhere along the ranges of 70, 80%. So you can consider the vast majority of the stateless diaspora are deprived of that. And the UNHCR is doing their work in terms of trying to provide a ID card. Some countries are not even allowed to operate, so the Rohingya who are in those countries don't receive that. In a country like Malaysia, for example, there are restrictions for how many Rohingya are able to get access to the ID. So the Rohingya who are there, there's no likelihood for them to get citizenship. They're deprived of actually participating in the local economy. And then at the same time, even a UNHCR card is considered a luxury which only a few of them are able to access to. And this has been the reality not just recently, but perhaps you can say the last 20 to 30 years. And the reason why we say from the Rohingya, from the community is, imagine yourself, if you're a Rohingya. If you're a Rohingya, would you wait necessarily for a solution to come from existing institutions? Is there a likelihood in the foreseeable future of the Rohingya being repatriated back into their homeland? It's looking unlikely, I mean, to say the least. And given their state in their host societies, can they expect citizenship or work permit or something that can give them access to a livelihood? That also seems very unlikely. So it's because of this unique situation that the Rohingya are in, and I'm not pretending that the Rohingya situation is the same situation for all displaced people, because we know it's not. These basic issues are the ones that most Rohingya suffer from. Lack of education, social exclusion, access to technology, so lack of digital literacy, and then lack of access to capital and financial resources. These are situations of statelessness, not necessarily those of immediate humanitarian aid. So this is what we're trying to tackle with our project. Yeah, I'll just skip this. Okay. The way our project is approaching it is we are looking at the issue of financial exclusion as an enabler to other basic rights, such as healthcare, education, legal rights, because if you have access to at least some capital, you're able to open these doors, whereas if you don't have access to capital, all of these doors remain closed. So we see financial inclusion as, you can say, a seed that we want to plant to give those Rohingya who are in diaspora something that over the course of maybe a decade can develop into something resembling of a microeconomy or a microeconomic institution. Okay, so just a background of the project. What we're looking at is trying to unlock different opportunities using a blockchain-based digital ID, and I'll explain why we're using the digital ID system. But our project is not an ID project. We're not trying to come forth with a competitive ID solution to replace the UNHCR existing ID or to come up with some national ID card or anything like that. What we're trying to do is create a dedicated financial platform that is Rohingya specific, but also that can be used as a model for other marginalized community, and have as an access key to that a digital ID, because you need to be able to recognize the user who's actually using it before you can actually grant them access to financial services, hence the need for the ID. Okay, so 3 phases, and this is the case with a lot of these startup projects. I mean, we're in the first phase where we're developing the foundations. We have a list of partners who are helping us in developing the ID infrastructure, the financial infrastructure. And scaling is the stage that we're looking after that. How can we take some best use cases in Malaysia that we're piloting and then broaden them to other more sensitive countries where the Rohingya are also living in substantial numbers. And then finally, seeing if we can build a virtual community of a sort. I wouldn't use the term virtual state, and actually I'm very skeptical of tech utopian sort of language and approaches to this problem, even though some people may accuse us of that. But what I see is, can, within the existing system of the UN, of NGOs, and of governments, you can create a complementary system that can get the community to empower itself and to collaborate and build consensus within them using technology that we already have at our fingertips. Can that be done rather than this aid model that builds a dependency of that refugee community, of that stateless community, where you don't have an end in sight? So that's what we're trying to look at with the Rohingya project. We are starting in our initial stage as a financial service provider. Our hope is, as we move on, as we build into a broader system, that system can be taken on by the Rohingya themselves. And through different tools, they can build consensus and look to not necessarily have a governing structure, but some way they can collaborate across borders with technology that we already know lends itself towards those functions. Yeah, okay. So, yes.
Do you have a time period for each of those phases?
Yes, so right now we're in phase 1, we're pushing our pilot next year, and then phase 2 is the year after that, where we broaden outside of Malaysia into use cases and then we don't necessarily have a timeline for phase 3. That's more of a long-term vision. Okay, I'll just skip over this. This is just a statement of where the Rohingya are at right now in terms of their financial situation. So phase 1, we want to have a digital ID, pilot ID that can be tested with 1,000 Rohingyas, build an ecosystem around that. We have 2 applications that we're working at right now, and before I end, I'll give you a demo of how the application works. But the idea is that Rohingya give them a specific dedicated crypto token that they can build and use among themselves, not necessarily as a financial tool, but as a social capital. So for specific functions within the community, if within the community an area needs to be cleaned, some people need to be taught, those who have access to education can extend that to others. Why not use the crypto token to give the Rohingya a sense of a wider Rohingya community spirit? That's the idea with the token that we want to launch beginning in January. And then having that as a test case and building that beyond just Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where we're based. So this is a question we get asked often. I'll very quickly mention it. We can maybe talk about it more in the discussion. How do we verify if somebody's Rohingya? We use an existing model that UNHCR has developed where they look at specific criteria related to geography, social, who is their social contacts, testing them on Rohingya language, cultural traditions, and professions. And then based on that, UNHCR is able to determine that somebody is Rohingya. Our model is using the same thing, it's just going a bit more into detail. Why are we using blockchain? It's not because it's a fancy technology, it's because it lends itself to the Rohingya case specifically, given its nature as a decentralized ledger. And we're very much aware of, for example, data regulations related to GDPR and putting personal data on the blockchain. So with our ID partners, we're developing the ID that can just have a basic function of being an access key without necessarily putting anybody's personal data at risk. Okay, this is I just want to focus on, so how would it look like? Actually, I'll just play the video later. Okay, so what does the future look like with this project? This is not necessarily our utopian view. What we see is if we can create a system where a financial service provider working within the community is able to add existing functions and then get Rohingya to be involved in those functions, to get them to collaborate more among each other within a host country, and then from that host country to other host countries, provide different services, you have a, you can say, a foundation to what could be considered a 21st century microeconomy. And that can be tailored specifically for a stateless people. So this is our broad grand vision that we're looking at with different features that are available specifically to Rohingya, but again, can be tailored to other cases. So I'll end by just playing the video, if you can, of our application, so that those who are in the crowd right now, you can at least see how the application is intended to work, and then hopefully that can be a conversation starter, because I know my presentation probably generated more questions than answers. And also, I don't pretend to have all the answers, because this is the first step for a very, very long journey that we're taking. We don't pretend that we have everything solved out. What we do realize is that the status quo is untenable, and something has to change, so we're deciding from within the community to take that first step. Do we have the answer to everything? No, but we hope that, you know, through forums such as these, we can get more of those answers. So if, on that note, we can just play the video of the application. Do you have the video? The video? Before I sign off, that actually was developed by Naeem, who's our Rohingya animator, so I just wanted to give him a plug because I told him I would. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions or thoughts, and I want to get the kind of second use case up. So why don't we go straight into that, and then we'll open it up for some discussion.
Thank you so much. Can we get the PowerPoint up? Yeah. There we go. Hello, everybody. My name is Vasa. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Irio. It's a pleasure to be here. What's really interesting for me is that I actually have a degree in international relations, so I definitely, I guess at some point I thought that I will work at the UN or some other international organization, but I didn't think it was going to be in the role that it is today, but that's how life works, so I think that's quite interesting. A few disclaimers before I dig into this. I wanted to be as hands-on as possible, so I wanted to give you a demo of what we developed, but unfortunately there were some technical difficulties, so the PowerPoint is going to have to do, but afterwards, if anyone's interested, you can come up to me and I can show you hands-on all the stuff that we've done so far. What I want to present today or talk about is the case for a medical passport for refugees. And just a few disclaimers before I start. I'm going to go into really specific things here, and I think we have Simon here then to pull us out of the specifics and give us some more of a general frame or framework of what we're discussing here. And also, Irio is a completely for-profit company. We're a startup based in Slovenia, and so this was sort of a project we did on the side because we met an NGO that we thought was doing great work in the Middle East, and we thought we could help them with the tools that we're kind of developing anyway. So keep that in mind as well. So the thing that I want to present to you today is, I'm sure, something that many of you have encountered, and you've probably encountered it when you either moved location for a job or were just changing your family doctor. And the thing that happens is that you always need to compile a list of all your medical records, and then you need to transfer them to a new doctor. It's really important for the medical professional who's treating you to have those records. Now, if you live somewhere where there's functioning institutions, those records are usually held by a healthcare provider, and you don't have to think about it a lot. With the refugees, that's very different. And so if you have that pain of trying to compile a complete medical history of yourself, maybe once every 10 years, sometimes the refugees have to do that for every visit to the doctor. And so the main issue really is that to have cost-effective and efficient treatment, we need to have historical healthcare data of a person. So the way we started thinking about this is that who's more interested in preserving that data than every single person? Now again, if we live in a normal state of things, then we don't care about this very much, but it's quite different for the refugees. This quest for a personal health record is not something that is a new idea. And in where I come from, it's sort of a nice to have. But among the refugees, we think it's a necessity, and it's the only way to provide or to ensure that the medical history of a particular person remains stored somewhere. So how do we go about achieving something like that? The first thing that's a bit tricky here is we had power cuts, now we have lights going on and off, which is nice, keeping us on our toes. Christmas, yeah. So we need tools for both sides. We need tools for doctors to input the data, and then we need tools for the patient to access and keep that data. The other thing that is sort of specific to what we were doing for this particular project is that the solution must be designed for the refugee situation, which means that there's going to be unreliable internet connection, there's going to be low budget equipment, you're going to have to capture data that you might not necessarily have to capture in the developed world, and so on and so on. So if we focus on the healthcare providers first, the medical staff, what did they? So we've been working with an American NGO who's been providing healthcare in the Middle East alongside the UN, and they've been sort of doing that as a standalone organization there, and they've been trying to collect medical records of the refugees there. Right now we're working in Syria and Jordan. In Lebanon and Jordan for the Syrian refugees. And the refugees stay in those camps on average between 5 to 7 years. So it's quite important for the NGO to try to store the medical history of the refugees that come visit a doctor for a particular thing. So right now they had sort of two alternatives how they could do this. They could either invest in an on-premise electronic health record solution, or they could use a cloud-based electronic health record solution. The first one is usually expensive, it's highly customizable, which is a good thing, but then you have to have it deployed locally somewhere. And it doesn't usually back up any of the data anywhere else. And then you have the sort of newer cloud-based solutions, which is usually affordable, it's usually quite cheap, but it's not customizable. And then again, it will back up data onto a remote location somewhere, but it usually needs internet to work. And we know that in a lot of those locations, the internet comes and goes a lot, like electricity here today. So those are kind of the two options. And then both of those options have this other issue, which is the interoperability of healthcare data, which is a whole different topic, and there's conferences organized on that topic. So they all store data in a proprietary format, and the data is not owned by the patient. And with the first one, with the proprietary format, what I mean is that if someone else would try to import that data into a new system, it would be difficult to do that. So what we decided to do is an EHR solution for, it was specifically designed for the NGO that's working there, but it was designed in a way that it doesn't need internet to work. It works locally on any computer. You can set it up very quickly, but it will store all the data on that computer. It will store it on a cloud, and it will also send it to a patient app. The data, the solution uses open data standards, which means that we're trying to be as interoperable as technically possible. And when there is internet, the data will be synced among different doctors or different local clinics that they have running over there, and it will be sent to the patient's phone. So the whole architecture provides independence and robustness. So it's kind of like, and each piece of software that they run is sort of an independent organism, so it can work without anyone else, but it will exchange data between different nodes when it has internet. And then the other thing where it becomes really interesting is, so now we've been talking about primarily how the medical staff enters the data, and then if the patient comes back, they can look up that data again, they can see the health records, and they can provide a better treatment. Where we think this becomes even more interesting is that if we start looking at new technologies and how to utilize that. And so first one that, again, every conference like this sort of has is everyone's talking about blockchain. But what's really interesting for us here is that once you have that data sent on a patient's phone, through blockchain we can ensure that that data is not tampered with, so we can ensure immutability. So we might not necessarily be able to figure out what data has been changed. For example, if a patient would want to go in and change their data about vaccination or what have you, but we would know straight away whether it was tampered or not. So if we do that, we can then turn that application or that data on the phone into a full-fledged medical passport. Of course, there's legal requirements to be able to do that, but from a tech point of view, that's something that we could do. And then the other one, which is probably more talked about, is the tokenization of that the blockchain enables. And so what I mean by that is that we all know that there's companies out there that earn a lot of money selling data. That's basically what Google and Facebook do, in a way. They say it nicer than that, but that's basically what they do. And there's definitely pharmaceutical companies out there who are willing to pay for certain types of data as well. And what we can also enable through that is that if we get to a large enough data set that companies would be interested in that, and if we offer a way to anonymize that data, then the refugees could actually sell that data and get some monetary compensation in return, which, again, coming from a developed world, you know, a couple of dollars to sell that data might not be life-changing, but sometimes life-changing drugs are not more than a couple of dollars. And sometimes people aren't able to afford that. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, where I think it becomes even more interesting in terms of more of a wider issue of data ownership and data control and so on, is zero knowledge data storage. That's something that we're working on. That's still a fairly new technological concept, and what it means is that any data that we store, because we still store all of the data in a centrally controlled cloud as a backup. If the refugees lose the phone, they could sort of come back to the data that we store for them. What we are trying to do is to store that in a zero knowledge fashion, which means we give every end user, or every refugee in this case, a private key with which the data is encrypted. And so all the data that comes to our servers is already fully encrypted, so we cannot tell what that data is unless that person gives us the key. So that means they give us the explicit permission to decrypt the data. And so we think that's a really powerful way of storing sensitive information, and it's really the only way to give control over the data to the end user. Otherwise, there's always ways to get around that. And then obviously there's, with blockchain, there's sort of this built-in identity where the refugee can easily demonstrate that they are the owners of that data. It's kind of like when you need to demonstrate that you own your iPhone or your laptop. It's really easy. You just type in your password. If the password's correct, assuming nobody stole it from you, then we all know that the device is yours. That was sort of the idea behind what we've been doing with this project. I don't have screenshots of the actual application because, like I said, I wanted to give you a demo, which I can still do later on a laptop, not on a big screen, but I do have a couple of photos just to show you where this has been deployed. So this is one type of a clinic that they use over there. Is just a shipping container that they've remodeled into a clinic that they can move around. And so we've equipped them with laptops, and they have the software running there, and that's what they're doing now. So that's all I had. Thank you very much.
So thanks to both of you. Maybe we can turn off this this moon up there, this bright light up there, as we move forward. So look, we're going to kind of put the panel up here and get you to sort of ask them all sorts of difficult and complicated questions. But just to get there, I just want you to do something before that, which is just for 2 minutes, so that everybody gets a chance to talk and think for a second. Just turn to the person next to you, either way, right or left, depending on your politics, and just like answer one or both of 2 questions. You know, what's smart that I've just learned, and what doesn't make any sense and underpins a question I want to ask. Yeah, so just spend just a couple of minutes. Just turn to somebody next to you and just kind of spill it out of your brain. Good guys, thank you. Now I'm going to put you up here. Yeah, I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Just to get them, just to get everybody to get a chance to answer it for a couple of minutes. And then also get rid of
I think that's an easy way to
1 minute, 1 minute. Okay, folks, can I have your attention back, please? Ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Okay, so let's make a start. Thank you very much. So what I want to do is just take just a few comments or questions. If it's like a super geeky question, don't ask it. Just don't ask it. Ask them some other time. You know, like, how did that bit of tech work on that? Just sort of leave that out of the room, because I don't think that's our focus. You know, sort of questions that try and figure out, you know, what are the boundaries of what they're proposing can really do, but also questions that are already trying to translate it into your world. So information you need from them that can help you figure, is this irrelevant to what you do, or does this provide some insight to what you do? So I'm going to take just a whole bunch of questions and comments, one after the other, and then you've got to remember them all and respond to everything. So, sir, do you want to just, since I don't know who you all are, why don't you say who you are?
Leif Kalev, Professor, Tallinn University, Estonia. Thank you, it was very interesting. As I have one question I will ask concerning Rohingya community. One of my fields is building up states and state capacity. Somehow it seems you're also building up a state or something like that in specific fields. You create basic identity infrastructure, funds, community. So I started to wonder how far could you envisage in going? You could also build up some kind of system of representation or virtual representation of interests. You could build up maybe some education or cultural sphere, maybe some at least voluntary public order institutions. So have you thought about that, and what are your thoughts?
Okay, so how far can it really go? All right, next question. Sir, let me take you on the next table. I'll come over to you afterwards.
Thank you. My question is on
Just
this.
tell us who you are, since I don't know.
Yeah, I'm Delaware. I originally from Afghanistan, but I work for UNDP Azerbaijan as its DG policy advisor. So my question is on this health passport. Well, that's a good idea to that the burden from the public sector is given to the private sector, and you know, with these innovative ideas, we can contribute. But the question is, when such practice becomes a public policy, then citizens come first before refugees. So we have to think about that. So we cannot just say, okay, health passports for refugees, while even in European countries, we have people that are not covered by insurance, health insurance. So we have to think about that before we jump into kind of, what you say, ambitious, innovative ideas, you know, that traditional donors will not buy it, you know, to fund such kind of initiatives. Thank you.
So I'm going to put an edge on your question, if I may, just to sort of, because I think the comment is very well taken. So my edge to the question is, you know, is this something that could either ghettoize migrants and refugees? You know, you create a sort of yet another ghetto. So that's the glass half empty version of your story. And a lot of people have said, don't do anything specific for refugees because it creates yet another ghetto. What we're trying to do is integrate them into society. And the second is, could things that one invents for migrants and refugees actually be for the broader population? You know, is this a stress condition on one particular community that allows them to innovate and leapfrog that others can then participate in. So it could actually go both ways. All right, third question. Yes, madam, over there. Let me just get a mic to you. Just say who you are, would you?
Hi, I'm Shelley Inglis. I have a really stupid question, and I'm not a tech-savvy person, but do both these systems fall down where refugees or Rohingya do not have phones? And in the case of the lack of access to phones, are you suggesting systems for distributing and how you would distribute then those phones and knowledge about the particular applications that they need to upload and then engage in your services?
And presumably that's not just phones, that would also be cell coverage. I mean, the whole sort of just digital
Right,
access.
sure, yes.
Sort of digital access infrastructure.
Thank you for
No, absolutely.
making it a better question.
All right, let me
Thanks.
just come over to here, please. Thank you. I'll come over.
My name is Robert Bernardo. I'm with the NDP Istanbul Hub. Thank you. These are fascinating. The issue of digital identity for the Rohingya, because you mentioned also earlier that even those with proper identities had been denied access. So I wonder whether digital identities would really solve the problem, because it might be about deeper biases or discrimination that's actually affecting much of these, which I'm not sure if the identity itself would actually solve. So your thoughts on that? Thanks.
And one of the points that UNHCR continually makes is that there are quite a lot of refugees that don't want to expose any aspect of their identity whatsoever for all kinds of reasons that stem from their original flight. Yeah? And so how does one both provide data that gives them access to services and opportunities and yet really ensure that their privacy can't be hacked? You know, maybe there's a sort of mixture in there. Okay, I'm going to take 2 or 3 more because these people can remember incredible amounts. Yeah, so madam, I'm going to come over to you.
Marianne Kramers from Democratic Society. A bit following on to the point you just made, I live in Brussels where we have a lot of trans migrants or trans refugees that want to go through Belgium but to somewhere else, usually the UK, and by hook and by crook are trying to avoid anything that would register or keep them in Belgium. And how do you avoid migrants being resistant or refugees being resistant to this kind of initiatives because they see it as a way to anchor them in a certain place when they want to be elsewhere or back home?
And presumably why they don't want to stay in Belgium you don't want to share with us. Right, no, we'll leave that for another time. Right. I'll just pass back one. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab Bashar. My question is, it's a very broad one for us all to think about, but I'm really curious what you think about this. Like, one thing I find fascinating about these experiments, as we call it here, is that they actually include a lot of intersection between different technology and social problems coming together, and at the same time they require a lot of technological knowledge, which doesn't really exist mostly within the host communities. So almost always that requires some external developed nation integration. Like in your case, for example, I think this NGO was very lucky to have met you probably, right? I mean, so like, I think it's like, what could we do to address that? Or do you think this is something like addressable? And maybe a less important question is, I very much liked the idea of long-term constructing a virtual community. And at the same time, I was thinking that, like, as you're building this, like, for phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, at the same time, you will be that you will have this challenge of constructing a social, a certain culture and certain norms and principles, and these people will have to instill it in them to be able to sustain this. The Rohingya community, and like, have you thought about that?
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more and then cut out because they're overloading, I can tell. So I'm going to come over here first, then I'll come to you, Sarah, and then I'll just call a halt on this round.
Thank you. Alma, UNDP Bosnia. I have a question for Vas. Did I understand you correctly? You said a refugee can sell their data. So that's
it was an optional extra.
That's it.
Right.
That's it. Thank you.
Sorry, no, wait, that's unfair. No, just hang on to the mic for a minute.
Okay.
So cough it up, good thing, bad thing, what do you think?
No, I thought that was really interesting because that was so out there. And I wonder, like, okay, so if they can sell their data, so there's a supply, And would this be just subject to a typical supply-demand principle? And they would receive something in return for selling this. So I'm just wondering, have you elaborated this further? Because it sounded like whoa to me.
Okay, there's a whoa, got it. Thank you very much. And last one, gentleman with the beard here. Thank you.
It's Hussein from Health Directorate Istanbul. Both projects are very much dependent on the users. Each project have to reach enough user to establish what they want to achieve. How they plan to gain this amount of user? Because if it is not enough user, the Rohingya project, you cannot build the ecosystem to run financial transactions enough to build a community. And also the other one, the medical passport is more dependent on users, in other words, clients, because there is a lot of EHR applications around here, and it needs to be adopted widely, or any other solution to integrate current applications.
And so the question is a critical mass question, is that right? Sort of scale. Is that principally the question you're asking? Yes, yes.
But it is vital to them to reach enough scale.
Right, got it. Okay, thank you very much indeed. So here's the cheat, right? So you don't have to answer the questions, right? That's the trick. So you can just ignore people you didn't like the look of, or who are trying to give you trouble. But sort of, and then it'll all be transparent. So if you give everything equal time, nothing is interesting. So pick out 2 or 3 things that that you can throw some light on, and try not to overlap with question answers. Please, why don't you start?
Okay. The gentleman from Estonia, actually, I wasn't surprised that you're from Estonia, given the nature of the question, right, on the virtual state. I mentioned my talk. No even positive profile. We're taking a step-by-step approach, and we're seeing where the project evolves, and we don't try and have necessarily a political objective with it. We're very clear on financial inclusion being our primary objective. But yes, the idea of a community is different from a country or a state, right? So a virtual community seems a more tenable and achievable goal, right? Because even at the most maximalist conception, we think that it will probably not encompass all the 3 to 4 million Rohingya. And when you talk about state, you talk about governance structure. Then certain applications that we want to use become politicized all of a sudden. So that's not really a discussion we're having at this point. Yes, having a community is a different matter. There was a question on phone access, and you can probably answer from yourself. But in terms of the Rohingya, we did surveys earlier this year, and nearly 100% of Rohingya, at least in Malaysia's case, have cell phone penetration. Now, the reason we make the distinction between refugees and stateless is that many of these stateless, they have a local friend, and through them they get a SIM card and they manage to get a cell phone, whereas refugees who come immediately aren't likely going to have cell phone access. So that's one reason we make that distinction. Yes, in terms of scaling up in the project, there has to be a feature that allows for not just a person to be able to input one user through their cell phone, but perhaps their whole family as well, so it can be much more scalable. And then maybe I'll answer a couple more questions. One was, okay, yeah. On the resources issue, okay, I think it was mentioned by you. You have many countries who dedicate huge amounts of resources to the Rohingya people. And I can tell you, from the Rohingya, they don't see much of this money coming into their communities. You have some country in the Gulf dedicating $50 million or $10 million. So if you can have verified mechanisms and initiatives that are very much closely connected on the ground and that are directly managed by Rohingyas being connected to these huge resources, I think it'll help just in terms of transparency for one, because this development issue where a lot of these funds get eaten up is another problem that we should look at, and I think technologies like blockchain can actually be quite helpful in that regard.
All right, I'll start with the easy ones first, and then I'll try to work my way up. Not everyone has a mobile phone, absolutely. Based on our experience, though, working with the NGO, and we visited a couple of refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan. Not every person has one, but usually there's one per family at least, and they seem to all have a local SIM card as well. I'm sure everyone in this room knows a lot more about the specific situations of refugees around the world than I do, but that's what we've kind of observed, and so we're quite optimistic that we're going to get to 100% penetration, almost 100% penetration relatively soon, because phones that are capable of doing what we're explaining here cost $10 to $20. And sometimes you'll see a family that doesn't have enough food, but they will have a smartphone, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. It just goes to show what kind of a necessity a smartphone today is, and the access to information really is. You can go without food for a few days. Sometimes you need to get critical information, and that's, I think, how a lot of the refugees see it as well. And critical mass of users, I absolutely agree with that as well. The fun thing for me here is that I don't need to know all of the answers, or even a lot of those answers. We're just trying to sort of build a tool that helps the NGO and over a long run helps the refugees as well. So, well, it's not their problem, but we've done this. So the NGO that we worked with, they had a problem because they kind of needed to have at least this basic business intelligence first, where they needed to see which camps maybe had a higher percentage of a particular illness, or whether there was some people who came in for a doctor visit a lot more often than someone else, to basically try to manage resources in an efficient way. And so I think we've already helped them with the tool that we've delivered. But of course, if I were just selling an EHR here, that's not really interesting, and there's a lot less long-term implications for that. So the really interesting stuff is a medical passport, but of course a lot of things need to happen to get to that. I definitely agree with that comment. I think a really interesting question was also on resisting data collection, if I kind of summed it up correctly, right? So refugees don't want to be identified in some way, or their data recorded somewhere, because they think that's going to hinder their opportunities to get into a certain country and so on. And I think in that respect, the refugee population is a lot smarter than everyone else, because everyone has that problem. We are beginning to see through Cambridge Analytica scandal, through other data privacy scandals, that a lot of companies out there know a lot about us. And so we all should have that urge to resist data collection. How to overcome that? We think one of the things that I mentioned in the presentation is that zero knowledge data storage. So basically, yes, store data on a person's behalf, but encrypt that data with that person's encryption key, so you're basically storing something that you don't know what is. So that's definitely something that we all should be thinking about. The selling the data. Yeah, again, that's like you said, that's a far out idea and concept, but I think the seeds that you need for that are already in place. Especially, if we look globally, I think US is far ahead of anyone else in selling data. In Europe, we have GDPR now, which makes it a bit more difficult, but US, as in other things, is quite liberal with selling data. And there's already providers in the US that sell a lot of the data. So they will, for example, they will go to a pharmacist, they will collect the prescriptions, and those prescriptions won't have names and surnames, but they'll have everything else. And then they will sell that data to pharmaceutical companies and so on. So that already happens. And then with data that's in the electronic health records, there's again US providers that, that their whole business model is based on selling the data, not selling the actual software. And so obviously that works if you have huge amounts of data, and then in US, for example, you know, you have the Facebook, for example, we have an average revenue per user is about, I think, $50–60 in a year for the data. For the refugees, of course, there's going to be less because there's less data as well, but sometimes it might be even more valuable because of some specific situations. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So for those who haven't had their questions answered, definitely blame them afterwards. I have 1.5 more questions. First of all, I wanted to come back to the question of the gentleman who has left. Maybe left, yeah. No, you're there. You're absolutely there. You know, which is helping a sub-segment. You know, how does that relate to the bigger project? You know, so you're working with Rohingya, maybe in Malaysia, but many other people in Malaysia needs access to services that they don't have. If you were working in Bangladesh, that would be the case 20 times over. And arguably similarly, you know, why focus on a subgroup, even if they're, you know, discriminated against in many, many ways and disadvantaged in many, many ways? There's this sort of question, which is not just a technical question, it's as much a political question. I think probably I would avoid the technocratic answer and kind of give your take on the politics. And then secondly, we're about to transition into the table conversations where they've got to take your genius and translate it into their work. So help them out. So no, very straightforward. So help them out. Just draw from what you've done 1 or 2 insights that are not specific to the kit, are not specific to displaced people, but kind of ways of figuring out solutions to complex emergent problems, you know, as you know, within the world that you've done it. Because I think drawing out your view on that might help people think about the relevance of your experience in their own context. So firstly, what do we do about the politics of host communities? Yeah, and then maybe that second kind of concluding comment, perhaps from both of you. Why don't we start with you this time?
Thank you. I said I was going from the simplest to the hardest question. That's why that one was left out, but you didn't let it go. No, I mean, it was a brilliant comment, and I agree with that. That in a way, focusing on a solution that is, you know, specific to a particular group, maybe at the end does more harm than good because it doesn't, you know, it sort of creates a ghetto. I definitely agree with that. It's difficult not to give a technocratic answer because one of the problems when building products is that people don't use products just because they're good for them. And that's a problem with adoption as well. And so if I translate this into our case here where we have a personal health record, we all know that having data about our health data in one place would be really useful, but it's usually useful once every 10 years, and so we don't really care about it. But then once every 10 years we do care. And so that was why we targeted the refugee population specifically, because we think that they experience this pain a lot more than someone else in a different situation. That was sort of it. But again, we're just trying to sort of treat the symptom here, but we're not treating the whole problem or the cause of the problem. And obviously that is a much larger and more difficult issue to tackle. Yeah, I guess one of the one of the things that I would point out is basically what I already just mentioned, is that people won't use a tool just because it's good for them. And that's something that's really difficult to understand or comprehend sometimes, but that's how we work. And so it's when you're designing a solution to a problem, because you're thinking about that problem all the time, you think it's so important that once you have a solution, everyone's gonna flock to it and start using it. It's rarely the case. That's one thing, and then maybe another more specific thing that I would point out is that I think, you know, this mantra of data being the new oil, sure, but that doesn't really solve anything or tell us anything. I think one thing that we definitely need to think about is how data is important in today's world, not because it's new oil, but because it touches upon our basic human rights, which is privacy, which is identity, and so on. And so that's something that I think we would need to think about a lot.
Okay. Just as perhaps a point we can use as a jumping board for further discussion, just to look at this idea of what is community empowerment, right? I mean, sometimes we have, just my observation, a very top-down view of community empowerment. I am going to empower this community, or this agency will empower this community. And can it be possible in a world where maybe there are leveling technologies that communities can equip themselves with certain tools and can be facilitated along a process of empowerment? Any marginalized community doesn't have to necessarily be refugees. And what would that look like, you know? And is that would require maybe those institutions that are used to managing exclusively the affairs of certain communities to perhaps give the reins in certain cases for those communities to make certain decisions among themselves. And can that happen? And what would that look like? And then also, if UN bodies, if they can see that on the ground there are these initiatives happening using technology, what should the approach be? Should it be wait until a solution is fully verified and then half the community have already adopted it? Or can you look at the early stages and think, is there a hand-in-hand approach that can actually take a solution and you can help assist it actually becoming something that can make a big impact?
Brilliant, thank you. So firstly, would you join me in thanking our two colleagues for their presentation? Thanks very much indeed. The people you didn't answer their questions, they'll come to you afterwards, I'm absolutely sure. So we're going to move over to the next session. I'm going to hand over to you to kind of set that up.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the speaker. Thank you to our wonderful host. I recognize it's that time in the afternoon where a lot of people are sitting in a room that's only half ventilated, I feel, and can probably definitely do with a drink if they haven't gotten already one. So before we do anything else, I'd like those of you who haven't had a chance to grab a coffee or drink or water yet to do that now, and we come back within the table straight away. close to a drink. So I suggest we get started again, because we have work to do. We've had two incredibly rich conversations, incredibly rich presentations and demos. And there's a lot of principles to work with. So whilst Nilgun rounds up people from outside, I invite you all to get settled. And can I just have a show of hands? Who here are table hosts? We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 5. So we have plenty of hosts. Great. Fantastic. Okay. Can those of you who are sitting at a table without a table host please join another table? Great. So can you join this table? Yeah? Great. And then we start. Can you join a table of your choice? Great. Fantastic. And then first, whilst everyone gets settled, I'd like you to focus in on where you're at personally, right? Can I have... Great. I think the tables are forming, and you all have a drink, and you all have your playbook. So I'd like you to take a good 5 minutes to really think through what this means for you. You've already written down in the first round what your objectives are and what tools you currently have. Right? But I'd really like you to reflect on what principles and mechanisms have been explored here. What principles and mechanisms of working with online communities, with new forms of data capture, data selling even. What forms of tokenization are being used here? What forms of identity, storage, and security are being generated here? What kind of new public goods are being created here? And how is that being done? So please reflect first on your own about what that could mean for you and your practice. Right? So we have, for this, pages 16 and 17 in that playbook. Pages 16 and 17, where the question is, what are these principles and mechanisms? What makes them different from current practice? What is this, and then what does this mean to you? I'll give you a good 5 minutes for this. Please go for it. And if you haven't already, moving on from the principles and mechanisms to how this could be applied to new projects, new prototypes. So many new themes are being explored here, which give rise to fundamental questions. And there's a lot of discussion going on already. But think about what this could be in your project. Think about how these new digital communities, these new blockchain technologies, could apply to what you could be doing next.
Positive, forward-looking. None of this negativity. I am trying to keep. I'm trying to keep these. I'm trying to keep them on the rules. Next time, gonna have. Next time we'll have.
Okay, do people need more time to write down individually their thoughts, or are they ready to move on? Okay, take a little bit, take a last minute. Go for it. There'll be lots of time for further discussion anyhow, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great.
We just didn't get into it.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Cool.
We can keep moving.
No, no, no. Take your time.
Named it, nailed it. Nothing else. Great. We're done.
Okay. You have, most of you, written down a lot of things for yourself. A lot of you started sharing already. And this is where we continue. I'd love for you to start or to keep discussing what these principles are that for you stand out and what they mean for you. What these mechanisms are that start to change the dial of what UNDP could be doing. What kind of prototypes you feel need to be created to scope out what these challenges to our governance and these opportunities actually mean. What would be a sandbox, a testing ground where you can start to work with some of these questions? How could you formulate a project that would start to investigate this in more detail, right? A series of questions were asked that perhaps haven't been answered, right? How could you create projects in your practice that really start to investigate this in more detail? Because that's where we'd like your feedback on. Take some time, introduce your work to each other if you haven't already, introduce your thoughts to each other if you haven't already, and start moving on to those ideas and principles. And use the mat. The mat is there to be written on, right? The new applications and ideas can be noted down there. The principles and mechanisms, there's a series of examples already, but feel free to use it to scribble and to keep a record that way of what you've been doing. You have around 20 minutes for this, so you have plenty of time.
Folks, can I have your attention just for a second? Just for 2 seconds. Just for a second. So, folks, I can't call you the $2 person, but I forget what your name. You're the person, right? So, just in terms of feedback, you've got another few minutes, but we want to constrain the feedback, because what we've noticed in the sessions this morning is that people come back with a lot of blah blah, right? You know, they go, let me explain the context, and here's the problem, and then you get a lot of big picture stories. And so what we're asking you is that you come back with an executable idea, but only one. So the table comes back with one executable idea. Yeah. So not sort of here's a way of thinking about the world. Yeah, we all know everyone's smart in the room, everyone's experienced in the room, but it's one executable idea. Yeah, so you've just got a few minutes. Thank you. Well, how much more time do you need? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 10 minutes. 10 minutes to go.
Me? I don't know who it is. Okay. Right, I was just wondering who, are you going to take it on?
For the Rohingya, because you mentioned also earlier that even those with proper identity
attention? Can I have all your attention? Because we're going to start. This group is going to start its very short presentation of, this group is going to start, fine, of a next-gen golf prototype that UNDP should take forward.
Thank you to the group for very interesting discussion. I think it's not about UNDP per se, but in the sense where UNDP is placed to work together with the other partners to support the issues related to migration and displacement. And very recently, we had a very interesting engagement within the office with IOM and with the conflict portfolio, where we brought together civil society from 3 countries, and we looked at the issue of migration and specifically remittances. And we were looking at how can we make the investment that is flowing into the country from abroad, how do we turn it from subsistence-based specifically to more sustainable solution so that it contributes to more sustainable community development for the common good.
This is very good context. So the prototype is?
Yes, and the prototype is that we bring together, and we actually had in the room at that workshop, we have one local government willing to participate in this. We have a private sector, for example, the bank, which is willing to say if the remittance is 3% is paid to the bank from the remittances, if the bank can take 1% of it for investment and top it up with another 1%. If we can have the schemes, the way we can kind of elicit the ideas, what are the priority areas for people in the communities that they would want to contribute and build on, and then develop not a ready-made copy-paste scheme, but rather designed to fit the purpose. So that's why we do not have a very specific outline at the moment, but we know where the need is. We know who might be interested in this, and we know that technology has to play a role in it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Applause. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Moving to the next table. Who will present your emerging prototype?
All right. So we talked about the 3 principles. The 3 principles we came up with are identity, privacy, and KYC. I guess that's more of a technical term, but KYC. We had a couple ideas. One was know your customer. Know your customer. We have 2 ideas. One is, I think the one thing the guys I wish explained is how they implement, how they prevent data from falling into wrong hands, for instance. Especially when you talk about, when you collect information about a persecuted group. That information can fall into, what if it falls into the hands of a rogue entity, or, you know, now you have a curated list of all the people and information from, all right, okay, so that's one, that privacy protocol. And the second thing was, if you keep track of events, like political events, geopolitical events, weather events, you know, all sorts of events, then you can sort of create a model where you can predict when the next migration will happen, or something like that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. 2 very good ideas. This table has been busy at work as well, and has come up with 1 prototype. Thank you.
Ray Boyle, UNDP, Istanbul Regional Hub. Our team lifted out the principles of sort of co-design, blockchain identity, obviously privacy, some online communities and distributed ledgers, and tried to see how we could unpack that into a particular prototype. We found out that Moldova is doing a really interesting prototype around M-Tender, which tracks the procurement process from which companies are submitting for the bid all the way through the end. And then wanted to add to that some sort of machine learning algorithm that would flag inconsistencies or corruption to perhaps an anti-corruption group to see where there might be inefficiencies in the system or ways that they're hiding or distributing the money unfairly, and then being able to track that over time. Through co-design, we thought, what is actually important to the public? If there is going to be a sort of dashboard interface for the accountability, what does that dashboard look like? Is it designed by the government, or perhaps it's designed by the public to actually demonstrate what is important when you're exploring transparency in the procurement process?
Fantastic, and all that within less than 2 minutes. Thank you so much. Moving on to this table now. Who will take the mic?
Yeah, so we want to prototype a displacement preparedness risk fund. The sort of issues we were responding to were a mixture of lack of sort of direct funds, which can happen at certain trigger points, and also lack of coordination of humanitarian and development aid agencies. So some of the trigger points we discussed was early warning system for climate refugees, but also data sovereignty we thought was a key principle that we wanted to include in that. Not entirely sure how to go about that yet, but maybe through a co-design process, we're going to figure it out. And yeah, it would be, I think those are the key points, and we're fleshing out the details. Was there anything my team would like to add? No? Yeah.
Fantastic. There's a very specific and bounded idea of brilliant work. I'm going to this table. Who takes the mic? Great.
Well, we discussed a number of issues, but in terms of the prototype, we came up with we looked at it in terms of disadvantaged groups and access to things that they lack as a result of being disadvantaged in some way. So our specific prototype is for trans people in Pakistan, because we're already working with them in some capacity. So because they don't have access to their medical records or birth records or any kind of documentation that they would have had at birth or during their younger years, because they're away from home now and aren't able to get access to them, they already have trouble accessing the national ID cards, and even if they get them, often the data is wrong and they face a lot of hurdles in order to get them. We decided that it would be difficult to have a parallel system of ID, but a system that we could sustain and that we would have support from government and other organizations would be possibly having along the lines of a medical passport, because we have a lot of organizations working on sexual minority rights, and their safety has consistently been an issue because of cultural non-acceptance of them as a community. So if we could establish medical records for them and have government backing, it would basically, we'd not only let them keep their medical records, but maybe see if they, if that whatever application they use to access them contains access points to where they can get help from places that are safe, where they don't have to face a lot of discrimination. So that is the prototype we thought of using these principles and mechanisms.
Fantastic, very impressive. Very good. Great, thank you.
Right, thanks. Martin Gramatic of HUE Innovating Justice. First, our group has a name, and the name is Happily Married. And this will connect to our innovation. The problem that we are addressing are non-registered marriages. In many countries, a lot of couples do not register their marriages for different reasons, which is leading to a lot of problems, mostly legal problems, but also economic, social, cultural, etc., etc. So our solution is very simple. When a couple is getting married or is starting to live together, a community figure like a paralegal, village chief, a priest, etc., is making a photocopy of the marriage certificate. Or it might be just a piece of paper saying that these two people on this particular date entered into some sort of partnership. This thing is being digitally signed with the private key of the paralegal, the chief, etc., etc. And then you have a proof that on a certain date, this thing happened. So we think this is a relatively easy, achievable and scalable way to register marriages and then to prevent a lot of problems from taking place. Of course, afterwards we are going to work with politicians to amend the legal framework to make it even more functional, but basically this is our idea. Thank you.
And the very last group in this corner before we go back to Simon.
Hello, my name is Daniel Swid. I'm with Regen Network. So the problem we wanted to solve here was, what we wanted to do is create social cohesion among the Lebanese diaspora. And we'd first start by kind of studying and mapping the divisions and thought lines of this diaspora and within Lebanon, but also outside of Lebanon. And we would rally them around the cause of reforesting Lebanon for a bright future. There's on the Lebanese flag there is the cedar tree. There's about like 9% left of forests in Lebanon. And so we would kind of create this cohesion amongst, it's something that everyone can kind of agree upon, I think, as their homeland. And then, so that's one side. And the other side is what we would do is basically engage NGOs that are already planting cedar trees and engaged in reforestation, and basically issue tokens that are backed by that Ecological Regenerative Act, right? So you have tokens or coins that represent the planted trees. And you can use those actually and create essentially marketing and advertising campaigns that are targeted to the Lebanese diaspora, and kind of, gamify a little bit the divisions amongst all of these different groups and see who can actually plant more trees, right? And as their divisions, they can start to basically replant trees in Lebanon. So, yeah.
And with that, I'd like to hand back over to Simon Zadek, who will share his last thoughts from across the session.
They may be my last ever thoughts, of course. You just never really know. So firstly, thank you and congratulations. I think when we jumped on you and said you've got to actually produce one sharp idea, we were only joking. But actually, you did really well. And actually, it's just worth kind of noticing, not necessarily that they were the right ideas to take forward, but that, I mean, of course they all were, don't misunderstand me, but actually that it's not that hard to draw functional and institutional insights from use cases and figure out how their application might be relevant in other domains. Yeah, and actually, we spend millions and millions and millions of dollars with all our assessments and evaluations and so on and so forth. And actually, these connectivities can emerge almost quite naturally if you have smart processes. And as a sort of side note to the organizers, this is a very smart process. Secondly, I wanted to kind of notice the kind of flip-flopping between design principles and design goals. Yeah, that some of you started with design principles, you know, let's have identity and let's have privacy and let's have know your customer and so on. And some of you started with kind of let's do marriages, and then in a sense kind of backed into what the design principles behind that might be. Now, I don't know if there's a sort of a golden rule to this, but my own experience is that the first route tends to give one somewhat abstract ways of thinking about design principles. That doesn't make them wrong, but it makes them quite abstract. So yes, privacy is important, yes, identity is important. So, whereas coming in through the second route, which is to work with a design that has a functionality and an outcome goal, and then backtrack into a set of design principles, that has tactical dangers because you can go wrong, but sometimes the principles that emerge from that are somewhat more granulated and somewhat more aligned to the performance of the design idea. So I quite like the second route, although I understand that there are sort of different views on that. I heard principles to do with function. I heard principles to do with the integrity of a system. I heard principles to do with protection. And I heard principles to do with opportunity. And I want to just touch on the protection and opportunity side. So on the protection side, there was, you know, the privacy of data and you know, the kind of array of stuff that we normally assume we are, as the UN certainly, principally in the business of ensuring. You know, that at some level we instinct towards governance as accountability, governance as protection, governance as security, governance as control, governance as compliance. And then obviously we're being encouraged to think more and more about the opportunity side. So we had the remittances idea and the fund idea, but it's interesting how we separate that out from governance and protection so oftenly. We imagine that they're sort of two different worlds, you know, whereas you know, actually governance is meant to drive productivity, it's meant to drive inspiration, it's meant to drive innovation, and so on. So connecting together some of these principles turns out to be perhaps almost as important as sort of defining them in the precise manners in which you did. And then finally, and I'm probably projecting, so sort of reading this in, but what I heard in a number of examples that were put out in your short sort of snippets was the importance of interconnectivity. Sometimes interconnectivity to what I've previously called sort of the incumbent system, the role of the state in a whole series of ways. Sometimes interconnectivity to other parts of the system. So if you want to do something on remittances, yeah, there's a whole value chain of actors that have to be engaged before you get anywhere near avoiding remittances all flowing into consumption and trying to channel some of them into longer term lending and investment. There's a sort of huge ecosystem that one has to build up before one gets anywhere near sort of what kind of a fund should we have and what should we do with it. And I think that would also be the same with marriage, although I don't really want to go into that right now. So obviously we should do the marriage thing. We did talk about the use of machine learning to really kind of make that work properly. So this group is very problematic. I just want to make that point as well. And I really think that the organizers need to do something about that. So look, so finally, just no great finale. Thank you very much. We set out to kind of understand a little bit more about where one might go in this kind of migration refugee space. It's a sort of completely non-trivial, massive, complex, wicked problem with many, many different aspects to it. Yeah, and certainly the intention has not been in any shape or form to trivialize that complexity. But our challenge with highly complex, multivariate factors that have dynamic and uncertain pathways isn't to try and solve to the whole system. Yeah, sometimes one does have to sort of cut out a chunk of it and try and see how that chunk is not just a bit of the story, but can trigger change in other parts of the system that one's trying to affect. And I think, you know, we haven't kind of played that out in full, but certainly the how of each of your design proposals may well turn out to be, you know, a much bigger issue and need to focus on than the what. You know, the what is clearly organized marriages, but but the how one does that becomes really the critical issue, and the same with remittances and funds and the other proposals that have been made. All that leaves for me is to thank the organizers, to thank the two panelists who I thought were absolutely fabulous, and to thank you all for kind of bearing with us through this session.